Steve, August Fáilte Arash to the Crazy House Prices podcast, the podcast where we dive deep into the Irish housing market and explore the factors that are driving prices up and maybe down. I'm your host, Kieran McQuinn, and in this episode, I'm joined by Kieran McQuinn of the Economic and Social Research Institute. You might see them as the ESRI. They're the people that put out all the big publications about basically the economy. We discuss the current state of the housing market, the reasons behind why we are where we are, the differences between building houses and apartments, and we'll also get Kieran's predictions for house prices in Ireland in 2023. So sit back, enjoy. Well, not enjoy because it's not really good news, but I suppose get ready to learn and be more informed about the Irish housing market here on the Crazy House Prices podcast. Hi, I am just going to pause the podcast for a second to talk to you about some sponsors of the Crazy House Prices podcast. This episode is sponsored by Daft.ie. Daft is Ireland's #1 property portal. Daft has the most properties available for sale and rent and is the preferred national property website amongst consumers in Ireland. So Daft.ie's core vision is to make buying, selling and renting property better for everyone in Ireland. So Daft's mission is to simplify each step of every property transaction in the Irish market to make buying, selling and renting in Ireland simple. That's why Daft.ie build innovative tools like Offers by Daft, an online real-time offers platform that provides never before seen transparency for the Irish consumer when buying a home. Are you looking to buy? Maximise your chances of finding your dream home by visiting Daft.ie, Ireland's #1 property website. Now, today on the podcast, I have Kieran McQuinn from the ESRI. Thank you for coming on to the podcast, Kieran, and we're hoping to maybe talk about house prices, why they are where they are, and maybe where you see them going. So if you want to maybe give yourself a kind of brief introduction and so the listeners can kind of figure out why your name is usually behind most of the publications on the ESRI around housing.
Well, thanks very much, Kieran, for having me on. It's always it's always a pleasure to talk about housing, although sometimes we don't have very positive or I suppose things to say about the housing market, and obviously at present I'm conscious of the fact, and we even see it here in the SRI. It's very, very difficult, particularly for younger people trying to get on the property market, and we see it very much from a recruitment perspective, and we can really see it beginning to bite in terms of recruitment, that people are just finding it very, very difficult, particularly when they come to Dublin. The cost and price of housing in Dublin is just very, very, very high. We know it at first hand because we actually estimate the rental indicators for the RTB. We've been doing that now for a number of years, and we've broadened it out over the last few years to look at regional rental indicators. But it really is just striking when you look at the figures as to how high and how much of people's take-home pay people are having to spend on either renting, or if you're lucky enough, in inverted commas, to get on the property market and to be able to buy. So I think, first of all, just to say, in terms of, we do a lot of work here in the SRI on housing. We have a research program with the Department of Housing, which has been very successful over the last number of years, and hopefully that's set to continue over the medium term. I'm lucky that I have great colleagues here who also work on housing, people like Conor O'Toole, Rachel Slaymaker, Wendy Dish, Owen Kenny, Eva Shield. We have a good team here of people. So we do a lot of work on that in the housing space, and it's a very much collaborative team effort in terms of what you see. I suppose in terms of the market itself, as we were just saying there, backing up, if you like, because oftentimes, when you're doing analysis or research, you tend to be very much consumed with the latest figures and the latest data and the latest trends, etc. But it is useful and informative to kind of step back and take a broader look and try and see why we are where we are and how that's going to impact us going forward. And I think, unfortunately, the story of the Irish housing market is that it's still very much feeling the ill effects of the financial crisis, which are now 10, 11, 12 years ago. And the financial crisis, for anybody who isn't aware of it, in terms of its implications, it had, a devastating impact on the supply side of the Irish housing market. So, a lot of developers and those in the construction industry were essentially wiped out because of it. But it also, of course, had huge impact on the financial sector, and I think that's a really important point. That we saw a massive credit bubble in the 2000s in Ireland and in other countries, but particularly in Ireland, where people were given both on the demand and the supply side of the market, if you think of it. So people from a mortgage perspective were given huge amounts of money in order to borrow, in order to afford house prices. And those on the supply side in the construction sector were given large amounts of finance to develop properties and develop housing estates, etc. That scenario has changed now completely as a result of the huge credit bubble and burst which occurred. And don't get me wrong, it's right that would be the case. We have a lot of regulation in place now, macroprudential regulation, a lot of regulation both domestically and at EU level of our banking sector. But that's important because what it means is that, the banking sector, I think it's fair to say, is not really in a position to kind of provide all of the finance that's necessary to generate the level of activity in the housing market that we need.
That we need, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, estimates vary as to what we need. We've done work in the institute, and it's a very tricky issue as to estimate how much do you need. Our estimate would have been, between 30 and 35,000 units per annum. However, that all depends on crucial assumptions around population forecasts, around household formation, which is a big one. But I think it's likely that we will be revising those estimates, and it's likely that the figure is going to be somewhat higher, and that's due to the kind of higher population estimates that came out of the census. It's also due to the fact that we have quite a lot of net inward immigration. We see that obviously in response to the Ukrainian crisis. So we will need probably at least somewhere in the region of 40, possibly more, 40,000 units per annum. Now, figures out today from the CSO show that we're going to hit around just under 30,000 last year, and that's up quite a bit from the previous year. Now, unfortunately, the pandemic has had quite a distortionary impact on the housing market. So what we've seen is booms and busts, even by property market standards. So, for instance, in 2020, the first real year of the pandemic, we saw a fall off in housing supply because housing construction was affected by the pandemic and by the health restrictions. However, since then, we've seen kind of a bounce back, quite a strong bounce back. However, it's unlikely that this year, if we're talking about short-term projections, it's unlikely that we're going to get 30,000 probably this year. I'd say it'll be probably more in the region of 26, 27,000. And that's based on the commencements data that we saw last year in 2022. And that's down to things like higher inflation and the higher inflationary environment that we've seen globally, both in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic due to the supply chain issues, but also now because of the pressures coming from the war in the Ukraine. So we've seen energy costs going up, etc. So that they've all had a big knock-on impact on inflationary pressures in the construction sector. So we're probably not going to see 30,000 units in this year, somewhere maybe in the region of 24, 25,000 units. But fair to say the trajectory, the trend is upward. So I think going forward in 2024, 2025, we're probably going to see more housing units built again, but there's still going to be a catch up with between what where we are and what we need to build in order to meet the demand that's there. And as long as you have that deficit, that shortfall, you're going to continue. Unfortunately, I think for most people, you're going to continue to see an upward pressure on both prices and rents in the market. I think that's really the outlook over the next while. We did see a surge. You referred to there about the study we did on before Christmas, which suggested that there was overvaluation in the market. Yeah. I think that's fair to say. I think what happened was the pandemic, as I said, had a negative impact on the supply side of the market, but it had quite a positive, if you like, impact on the demand side, mainly because savings levels went up very starkly. People weren't buying, they weren't purchasing, they were saving a lot, and they used and have been using some of those savings, I think, over the last year or two to purchase housing. And we've seen house prices, jump considerably. House price inflation had all but leveled off just prior to the pandemic. Yeah. House prices were growing at around 0.5%. In the last year, they've been growing at 14, 15%. And it's just not sustainable going forward. People just cannot afford that kind of increase in prices. So that's a kind of an overview, if you like, of where the market is at present. As I said, it's really, I think, the problem with the housing market is that there's always a lag between the demand and the supply side. The demand side can change instantaneously almost.
Mm.
If economic conditions improve, if unemployment falls, if interest rates fall, demand increases quite sharply. On the other hand, there's a lag there as far as the supply side is concerned. But it's really it's a real problem in Ireland because of the ill effects of the financial crisis and the fact that there's a lot of knock-on negative implications to do with that. And as I said, particularly the funding issue is a big issue, as far as what the banks can fund now.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we're at at the present time.
And I guess kind of just going back to those figures. So I actually saw that release earlier as well, that they're hitting just about 30,000
Mm.
um, deliveries of homes. But I guess, as you said, if the demand, if we really need to be doing, say, 45,000, and that 30,000, the highest figure, I think, since 2000 and since before the crash
Yeah.
anyway. So if there's that demand every year and that's compounded, if we need, say, like, so the way you calculate the figures then, so say we need 45,000, is that taken into account that we've missed, say, by 10,000 every year before that, or how does it work?
No, that's a very important point. It doesn't. This is basically just the net addition we need every year to meet the new demand, but it doesn't take into account the backlog and the
Mm,
fact that we haven't been hitting that figure for a long, long time. I mean, only a few years ago, housing supply was down at 5 or 6,000 units
yeah.
per annum. So there's a huge shortfall there and a huge pent up level of demand out there. So I think in terms of meeting the overall situation, you're talking about a higher figure again, if you like, over the medium term. So
And one
it's a
that's
huge
just
challenge.
not possible, really, I suppose, given labor constraints, given the lack of
Uh,
actual feet on
well,
the ground to be able to build them.
it is a big challenge, certainly from I think the constraint I would see is more from is on the funding side, as in who's going to fund all of this. Who's going to provide the finance to the developers, to the construction, those in construction, and to a certain extent, who's going to provide the finance to people looking to buy, on the mortgage side. So I
Mm.
think that's more where the constraint will come. I mean, uh, technically or physically, we built 90,000 units per annum at one stage. Now, we built them in the wrong place, and we don't want to necessarily go back to that, but we can build quite a lot of housing when we need to. There are other challenges though, and I suppose one big issue going forward over the next period of time is how we meet our house building challenges and objectives, and also meet our climate change. So the whole issue around
Mm.
retrofitting housing, there's a huge scale of investment required there, and again that's going to have implications in terms of us meeting our house building targets as well. So there are huge challenges, there's no doubt about that. But I think one of the major issues and major challenges is more on the financing and funding side of the increased activity. I think the labor, if the opportunities are there and the housing and and the funding is there, I think the labor will come, if you like, and the labor isn't so much of a challenge. But I think there are other challenges there for sure.
And I guess historically we had those problems. Like, I mean, I'm sitting now in a house that we just bought that was built in 1922, and
Mhm.
I believe a lot of the more, so this was tenant purchase scheme, a lot of social housing schemes back then, the labor was essentially imported. It wasn't Irish people building them. I think they imported a lot of the labor from the UK. I think some from
Mm,
Germany. I think I remember reading. So I guess, as
okay.
you said, if the funding is there, I mean,
Yeah.
are we going to expect all the Irish trades over in Australia to move home to build them? Probably not. But where are we going to get them from? I guess is
Yeah.
the
Yeah, I think, I mean, we tried to scope out some of these issues in the paper we did there just before Christmas as well on kind of capacity constraints.
yeah.
And we were looking at the kind of where immigration is coming from recently into Ireland. And it's clear that it's coming from a variety disparate of sources. I suppose the one difference between now and maybe 20 years ago is that we got a lot of labor 20 years ago from Eastern
Mm,
Europe, and a lot of those from the construction sector came over from Eastern Europe. Now, obviously, those economies are more developed now than what they were 25 years ago. So you're not probably going to get the supply of labor from there. But I think there are other areas, and we have seen it. It just the types of people who are coming and working into the domestic economy over the last number of years are more in other areas of the economy. They're more in ICT,
yeah.
shall we say, more high value added areas, higher paid areas of the economy. Trying to attract in construction workers is going to be a challenge. There's no doubt about that. But I think if the funding is there over the next period of time, then I think you will secure labor in order to do it. There's also an issue around and we looked at this as well, is that the actual fall off in people working in construction wasn't as great as what you would expect it to have been given the fall off in residential construction. So clearly there was a kind of a substitution or displacement of people out of residential construction into commercial property, hotels, etc.
Yeah.
So there is the potential for a rebalancing, if you like, in that sense, that people who were working in more commercial construction maybe could shift into the residential space in order to meet meet the supply requirements going forward.
Yeah, and I just think anecdotally, where I live, there's a massive amount of development around me. There's a lot of hotels, student accommodation, built to rent, and so parking is a nightmare because it's city centre.
Oh
But
yeah.
a lot of the cars are northern regis, so it's
All
just
right.
it's
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
interesting to see like nearly every single one of them is a northern reg, and then they're driving back, and then they're coming down. They're here kind of 6 7 a.m.
Yeah.
So they're working hard, but I guess as you said, a lot of maybe a lot of the trades are building more commercial rather than residential. So let's
Yeah.
say I'm a developer or I'm a builder,
Mm.
and I have a plot of land and I have planning and I want to build 300 semi-detached, three-bed semi-detached houses in a Dublin suburb. How so? What you're saying is it's near impossible for me to get the funding from, say, a domestic lender. Is that the case? So Bank of Ireland aren't going to give me the funding to build those. So this is why we're getting a lot of the kind of
Yeah. Well,
pre-purchased or
yeah. There's a number of issues there. Firstly, what the banks previously, I mean, it was explained to us. We had people coming in, quite frequently into the SRI from the construction sector, from the banking sector, just kind of, I suppose, having kind of exchange of views and opinions. The way it was explained to us was before, a property developer might be able to get during the Celtic Tiger years, if the overall, however much it was required, was say in terms of developing a site, the developer might have been able to get upwards of 6, 70, 80, maybe even 90% funding from a bank in terms of the finance provided. And then he'd have to, or she'd have to stump up the remaining 10, 15% in terms of equity. Okay. That's changed now down to like, you probably get somewhere in the region, you'd be looking to get somewhere in the region of 50 to 60% finance from a financial institution. And they will look for the other 35, 40% equity finance to come from another source. That's quite a lot of money and quite a lot of revenue that would have to be generated. The other issue is that, in a nutshell, if you want to deal with a lot of the pressures that are there in the housing market right now, and you were asked, well, what's the silver bullet? Well, it's essentially apartments in Dublin. I mean, that's really, I suppose, what we're talking about, because that's where the real demand is. Okay. Therein, the problem then is that you're looking at a difference between funding apartment construction versus funding, we'll say, the kind of housing estates that we would have traditionally looked at.
yeah.
The difference there is that if you're a developer and you're funding a housing estate, what you would typically do is you would maybe build 10 houses initially. You sell them, you get in a certain amount of equity from whoever's buying them. You then go back to the bank and you refinance, and then you develop the next 10
The next
units,
phase, yeah.
15,
Yeah.
the next
Okay.
phase, etc., etc., etc. You can't do that with apartments. You can't build the
Yeah.
first 2 floors and say,
Yeah,
well,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I'll sell these and then I'll go off and I'll get the funding for the next 2 or 3 floors up. It doesn't work like that. That's a problem as well. That's another
Okay.
problem as far as funding is concerned. So that's where it's really kind of biting, I think, as far as the funding is concerned. As far as developers are concerned, they're having to secure finance from other areas. That's why, if somebody can come in, like some of these institutional investors, provide a lot of capital up front, from a developer's point of view, there's no choice in the matter. You simply have to go with that. Also, you're seeing a lot of developments for social housing being provided, and are becoming very attractive for developers as well, because the state is coming forward and saying, well, okay, we'll buy X number of these units off you for social housing purposes, and here's, essentially here's the check up front, or here's, a good portion of the check up front. So that's becoming very attractive for developers in terms of securing that extra equity, if you like, that goes along with the traditional finance of funding the development. So those are some of the issues then that you're seeing in terms of the kind of units that are being provided and the kind of finance options that developers are availing of.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, and it's a good way to think of it in terms of, because we always see that with phases in housing developments. First phase, and then they're bought out, and then the next phase, the houses are probably 20, 30 grand more expensive, then they're sold. And as you go on, then, but it's interesting, you kind of never really think, I haven't anyway thought about that in terms of the apartments. You need to build them all in one go, because you
Exactly.
can't you
Yeah.
can't have someone living in the apartment, then you're trying to build another floor on top, like so.
No, no, exactly. That's the nature of it, you see.
Mm,
So that present and that's all against the backdrop of the banks, the whole nature of lending being far tighter now than what it was 15, 20 years ago. The banks simply cannot lend. They're just not allowed to lend the kind of sums. And that's right. I mean, because otherwise, if they were, you'd end up with back in the kind of scenario we had in 2005, 6 and
yeah,
7, where things just got completely out of control, and we all ended up paying for it. So
yeah.
it's important, but it does pose a challenge. The other thing, just to say, I think, and it is worth saying, even though the situation is particularly acute here in Ireland, and there's no doubt that it is, these are problems that you're seeing around Western Europe, and in certain parts of the States as well. These kinds of issues really are coming to the fore of rising house prices, supply not being able to keep up, and kind of similar policy mistakes. We've
Yeah.
argued for a while now that one of the big policy mistake was the government leaving the housing market. That really the government needs to be in there providing a certain amount of social and affordable housing every year, and that really didn't happen from the kind of early 2000s onwards. And that was something which you see across Europe. It's not just in Ireland, but it's something that you see after the financial crisis, the kind of the government or public sector leaving the housing market. And I think
Yeah.
that's really kind of leading to a lot of the problems that we're now experiencing.
And that's something that I'm always thinking about, because to me, it just seems like an obvious solution to a lot of the problems. Because let's say there's very few houses being built that are available for sale. So as you said, it's mostly apartments, and the way that it works, they need yield, so they're all for rent. It's too expensive to build them to sell. So what we're seeing is a lot of, basically everybody is competing for a very, very small number of supply of houses, say, for sale. And then you're also competing against the state, because they're not building their own ones. So
Mm.
that just it means there's such a massive reduced supply, and then everybody's fighting over a few houses, so the price of them goes up. That's just normal. But that's something I'm always struggling with, is okay, well, the government have this land. We have money now. It's not 2010. We do have money now. And I know they have the rainy day fund and all that, but we're taking in more money now than we ever have. So
Mm.
what is stopping them from, say, the government then just going back to what they used to do, and then providing the social housing themselves and building them, getting the people in to build them for them, and the government acting as the developer, and then that stops them relying on the private market to supply everything.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, the penny has dropped, I think, but unfortunately, it has taken a while. So, I mean, if you do look at the Housing for All strategy that was outlined There are positive elements there in terms of there's, quite a specific increase in the amount of government funding towards social
Yeah.
and affordable housing. And crucially, it's kind of multi-annual. So it's committed over a number of years. It's not saying the government saying we're going to increase expenditure this year and then, we'll see what happens next year and the year after. They've committed it over a number of years. The problem is just that, the problem had been allowed to develop and fester for so long that it's not going to be one that can be resolved overnight, unfortunately, So you are paying the price for, inaction over the last period of time. And as you say, a lot of that goes back, unfortunately, to the way in which essentially Europe responded to the financial crisis. If you look back at it, it really would have been absolutely ideal if member states had been able to, for example, engage in a public housing scheme, particularly ourselves, for instance, around about 2010, 11, 12. If you think of all the builders and tradespeople who were unemployed at the time because all
Yeah.
the construction sector had been decimated. Well, if the government had been able to step in at that stage and employ those people to build a certain amount of social housing over a number of years, then, the situation would have been radically different to where we are right now. But, Europe pursued a certain kind of policy response to the crisis. I think a lot of people now agree that that policy response was incorrect, or certainly was misplaced in certain areas. And there certainly are lessons to be learned in terms of, governments being able to spend money in areas, in capital expenditure areas, particularly such as housing. But again, going back to what we kicked off by saying, unfortunately, the supply side of the housing market takes a long time to get up and running and to start supplying the level of housing that's required. And we have such a backlog now that it's going to take quite a few years to clear it. And the other, I suppose, issue is, as we talked about, the constraints. I mean, we have a lot of money, but it's being able to spend it and spend it in a productive manner, I suppose, is the challenge going forward, and making sure that we do get value for what we spend, and that
Yeah.
as much of it ends up in extra housing units as much as anything else.
Yeah, and I know they've committed to trying to phase out that leasing, which is a bad. I think as an economist, you probably see it's a bad return on investment if they're leasing for near market rates for a long time, and then at the end we don't have an asset. But it,
Yeah,
I guess like with all those kind of factors taken into account, something that I know people listening to this will always want to know, and it's impossible to predict. But I guess if anybody's in a good position to maybe make a prediction as to what you feel like might happen this year in terms of 2023 and house prices, maybe even rental prices, what way do you see things going this year?
yeah, I think. I don't think you can't expect that house prices are going to continue to grow at the rate at which they have been growing over the last while. As I said, that's due mainly to the distortionary impact of the pandemic. So I think this year what you'll see house prices continuing to grow. I think they will continue to increase, but I think the rates of increase will be a lot less than what we saw last year. Last year we saw 14, 15% per annum. That can't continue. So I would say, you're looking at low single digit house price inflation this year. You're also looking at, I think, the rental situation. You're going to continue to see upward pressure on rents. As we said, as long as you have, the amount of housing supplied is less than what's needed, you will see upward pressure on rents. But I think you probably should see the rental pressures easing slightly. They're at around 7 or 8%. So I think, again, you would probably see it being less than that over the next year in terms of the annual average. So I think housing costs, I don't see house prices falling anytime soon, unless interest rates continue to increase. I mean, that is one area where you could see a fall in house prices. But I think you will continue to see house prices going up, but I think at a lot slower pace than was the case over the last 12 to 16 months.
Okay, so for people who are kind of maybe thinking of buying a house or a home, I guess the alternative is to rent, and that's something I'm always
Mm.
like if they're, let's say if rent is going up and up, and rent figures are probably going to go up higher than house prices are going to go up. eh, They need, I guess, people need to make that call as to how much they'll be spending on rent compared to this house is probably going to be maybe 6, 7% higher next year, the same
Mm.
house. But that's assuming that the same house will be available next year, which again, it probably won't be. So I guess that's where people always, well, I get asked all the time, and I'm just like, I don't know, I haven't a clue. You need to talk to an expert. So this is why I like to try and get experts
Mm.
onto the podcast to give us a more educated opinion on it. So I guess to summarize that, you're kind of hopefully anyway, prices don't continue to go up at 14-15% as they have been, and you're looking at single digits. But then, as you mentioned, interest rates, I think, are a hot topic at the moment. And I know historically, usually 1% in interest rates going up. I think house prices used to drop by about 10, but that's in a market where supply is kind of, steady along with
Mm.
demand, whereas we're not in that situation, unfortunately. So I think then the other side of that is when interest rates go up and if prices are coming down because of that, it's, I suppose for me personally, it's probably not really a good thing because people are getting, the same, say, standard of house, but for a lot more money every month
Mm.
because interest rates are so high. Um,
Yeah.
and that reduces then their ability to basically pay for other things. And as you said, we're spending such a massive percentage of our take home pay on rent and on mortgages compared to, say, my parents or my grandparents or whatever. So an interesting one there. And so I think people love, getting predictions as to where they
Hmm.
think things are going to go. But I really appreciate you taking the time, Kieran, and giving
No
us your
problem.
expert opinion on it. And can people kind of, are you on Twitter? Can people follow you on Twitter
I
or,
am, yeah.
yeah,
I'm on Twitter and mainly just kind of for advertising
yeah,
whatever work we're doing. So yeah, you can follow all our publications that way, and any kind of contributions we make in terms of the popular media and stuff. We tend to put it out on Twitter. So
yeah.
yeah,
So
very
it's
much so.
it's esri.ie, and then it's Kieran McQuinn on Twitter. And then I
Yeah.
think people like, I try to read the reports. They tend to be very, some of them are hundreds of pages.
Yeah, they are quite long. We tried to summarize them as well, but
Yeah,
yeah, no, they are, by definition, we try and do as detailed work as we can, and make sure that we outline everything. I mean, one thing I would point out is that everything we do is refereed as well, and that's crucially
yeah,
important, that the kind of quality control is there, because obviously there's a lot of people involved in the property game, and they're coming from all different perspectives. So it is important that I think anything that's put out there is refereed from our perspective to ensure that it does meet that kind of quality benchmark.
yeah. And it's statistics and it's unbiased. It's not,
Yeah,
someone.
we don't have a skin in the game, to put it
Yeah, exactly.
in
Yeah,
that sense.
yeah,
We're trying to call it as objectively and as impartially as we can. And yeah, as I said, particularly this issue arises with something, for instance, like the structural demand issue. How many houses
yeah,
we need? Some people would have you believe we need 100,000 per annum. And those people sometimes are closely connected to the property sector. Whereas, any work we've put out in that space has always been very, very clear in terms of our scenarios and our assumptions about population and things like household formation rates, which are crucial determinants of that figure, that end figure. So, yeah, everything we do is refereed.
that's fantastic. And I think as well with the reports, a lot of any articles you kind of see around housing tends to come from your reports and from CSO statistics as well. So it's important that people
Yeah.
also read the source of that, which is going straight to the ESRI. So we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Kieran. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Kieran. No problem at all.
I'm going to pause the podcast for a second because I want to talk to you about a company called Financial Planning Matters. Their website is fpms.ie. This is a company that I know very well, and the team behind it are fantastic. It's a small Irish company that believes that financial planning should be accessible, easy to understand, and affordable for everyone. That's why they offer personalised financial advice that's tailored to your unique needs and goals. Their team of expert financial planners will look at your current financial situation and develop a personalised strategy to give you a roadmap to achieve your financial goals. It's not just about setting up a pension or investing your money. They'll consider all aspects of your finances to help you get to where you want to be. So that could be saving for your deposit. It could be knowing where to invest your children's allowance. It could be maybe you have loads of money and you want to know what to do with it. So their customer service is incredible. I've been using them for over a year now and I cannot recommend them enough. So check out fpms.ie. Now back to the podcast. Agus Shinné le an episode seo of the Crazy House Prices podcast. I hope you found that conversation with Kieran McQuinn of the ESRI as informative and interesting as I did. His insights on the funding of residential developments and his predictions for the future of house prices in Ireland were quite enlightening, I guess. I think it's really important to get insights from qualified experts like this on the podcast so that we can all get a more informed picture of what's going on in the market. So a special thank you to Kieran and also my sponsors of the podcast and also my patrons for supporting the podcast, the Instagram page, and pretty much everything I do. So if you're looking to buy a home in Ireland, I have some good news for you. My book is now finished, How to Buy a Home in Ireland. It is available to pre-order now and it will be officially released at the end of March. So you can pre-order it by going to the link in the episode description or by checking out the link in my Instagram bio. My Instagram is @crazyhouseprices. Thank you for listening. Agus slán go fóill.